Okay. Welcome everyone to the Russia Direct Webcast, which offers the series of discussions with international affairs experts discussing key events and trends which drive a global political agenda. And today we're going to discuss a very important issue of the United Nations and its role in world affairs. And I'm the host of today's webcast. My name is Alexey Khlebnikov, and I'm the senior editor of Russia Direct. And I'm pleased to be joined by two prominent experts who enthusiastically agreed to participate in our discussion today. So we have here with us Fyodor Lukyanov, who is an editor-in-chief of the analytical journal Russia in Global Affairs and chairman of the Russian think tank, the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. Hi, Fyodor.
Hi.
And we have Richard Gowan, who is an associate professor at Columbia University and also is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Hi, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning from New York.
Morning. So, as we know that this year's UN General Assembly session is the anniversary, and it celebrates the 70th year since the organization was established, and the discussion, that will start next week on September 28th, when the general debate starting is promised to be very, very hot and interesting. Another issue is that not an issue, but the promising move, which the President Putin already announced that he will deliver a speech, and it will be the first in 10 years. So the last speech of him was the address to the in New York to the UN General Assembly 2005. So let me start just with a general question on the UN and its current role in resolving regional conflicts, as recently we see them erupting throughout the world. So Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya. So how do you assess the role of the UN in resolving current regional conflicts? Gentlemen, who wants to start first?
Maybe first from New York.
Okay, Richard, please.
Well, I would say that the UN actually does a rather good job of dealing with conflicts which you haven't named, those in Africa. So the UN is in the lead in Mali. It's struggling with the situation in South Sudan. Its performance is often imperfect, but the UN is playing a leading role down in Africa. By contrast, it is marginalized over Ukraine because Russia and the West are never going to agree in the Security Council over how to resolve the Ukrainian crisis. And I think the UN is pretty much falling apart in the Middle East. And what we have to see next week is whether President Putin actually has a plan that everyone can accept for dealing with Syria. I rather doubt that he is going to offer a plan that everyone can accept. And I fear that we're going to see the UN continue to struggle in Syria, but also in Yemen and other parts of the Arab world.
Mm-hmm. Fyodor, what is your take on that?
So, I think that when we talk about successes or failures of the United Nations, we should be, how to call it, we should be correct, because we cannot blame UN for something, because it's not, UN is not an actor per se. UN is a mirror which reflects the ability or disability of major powers to act together. And we cannot demand from the United Nations that they, I don't know, apparatus and all people there, they will be more efficient than leading powers, first of all, P5 allows them to be. And that means that the current situation, what Richard already mentioned, Ukraine and the Middle East, both are very major political crisis areas where not only particular problems of those areas are at stake, but also principles of how international actors, big actors, cooperate or not cooperate. And in this regard, I think UN is absolutely indispensable as a forum, as a platform where solution should be found. If this solution is not available yet, it's not the UN fault.
Mm-hmm. I agree with what you said, gentlemen, but one point is that Richard rightly mentioned that conflicts in Africa, there is a big deal that UN plays there. But the most, so to say, important and most kind of dangerous conflicts which could escalate the whole, the regional, not the regional, even global stability, they are in the Middle East and currently in Ukraine. And I also agree that the organization, as an institution, it has ability or disability, so we cannot blame UN for being like effective or non-effective. It's true, but if it is a mirror which reflects the current situation in the world, should the UN be reformed appropriately to reflect the current situation in the world, like in global affairs? Richard, maybe you will start.
I think the priority has to be dealing with the crises that we face today. There is always discussion of UN reform, and especially Security Council reform. And India and Brazil, along with Germany and Japan, keep on arguing that if they were permanent members of the Security Council, somehow the UN would function much better. But the reality is that Security Council reform is politically impossible right now. And the existing Security Council does have to collectively start working better over Syria and other crises in that region. Because I think that the sheer number of deaths in Syria, the sheer number of refugees flowing out of Syria, is turning into a humiliation for the Security Council and for the UN as a whole. And the UN's humanitarian systems, which are to some extent independent of the great powers, although they rely on governments for money, are falling apart in the Middle East, as I say. They're really crumbling. They're failing to deal with the number of refugees coming out of Syria. And this has to be dealt with as a matter of urgency.
Yeah, but in that case, should the UN try to deal not with the consequences of the crisis, but with the reasons of the crisis, the causes of the crisis? Because as we, what we see currently, the refugee crisis, it's a consequence of that. So how the UN should address dealing with causes, not to to prevent in the future, you know, this kind of conflicts.
Well, I think if you were to travel back in time to the beginning of the Syrian conflict in 2011, if the US and Russia in particular had been willing to take a slightly more constructive approach together in dealing with Damascus, then I think we could have averted this conflict, and there are lessons to learn from that. The problem was that back in 2011, the debate over Libya and how NATO was conducting the war in Libya made it impossible for Moscow and Washington's allies in London and Paris to come to that sort of deal over Syria. I hope that what we'll learn from the Syrian example is that great powers need to act quickly at the Security Council to prevent violence and deal with the causes of conflict, as you say. In the Syrian case, it's too late. We're dealing with a completely shattered state.
Okay, Fyodor, may I ask you, how would you characterize the position of P5, permanent 5 members of the Security Council, on the UN Security Council? How they view the organization, and what is their positions on the reforming the UN, and in particular the Security Council?
I'm afraid that, in fact, all those 5 countries, despite big differences between them in many issues, they're pretty united when it comes to the idea to reform UN Security Council. All of them will do everything to prevent it. And it's very natural and understandable. I don't remember any case, any example in political history when powers which would have some privileges would voluntarily give up them. And this is, I think, it's quite normal political behavior. Of course, on the rhetorical level, we hear from Russia, from the US, from other countries. By the way, not so much from China and France and Britain, that they support the idea of reforming, but in case it's a consensus view how to do it. That's a little bit hypocritical, because everybody knows that consensus is impossible in this case, and then you can easily say that we would agree if everybody else would agree, and which is anyway, which will not happen. I think one reason for not reforming, why we can't expect reform is just a position of P5. Another reason, which is actually quite significant, the current cancellation of Security Council permanent members is a result of a big war. And that was a normal situation in mankind's history, when after the war, winners decided how to rule. Now, even if we imagine that P5 countries suddenly, for some reasons, decide that we need to reform, we need to extend Security Council, what are criteria? Which countries to adopt, which not? What should be taken into account? Size of economy, size of population, regional principle, role played in international affairs. So you will never find a way how to formulate those criteria so that everybody would agree. So I think UN Security Council is unreformable. At the same time, I think, of course, I understand very well why powers outside the UN Security Council talk so much about this. But even if, again, imagine that it will be extended, what will change? The extended Security Council will be as split on vital and important issues as the current narrower Security Council is. There were some crises when Security Council was very much representative. I think the Libyan crisis, during this Libyan crisis, Germany was member of UN Security Council, and all BRICS were members. So what? It did not change much in efficiency of this body.
So does it mean that the UN is sort of stuck in its current situation of being underperforming in dealing with current conflicts?
Of course it's stuck. I wouldn't overestimate the ability of such bodies, even in ideal situation, hypothetical situation, everybody is committed. I don't think we can expect miracles and wonders. What is important, and I think this trend will be stronger in years to come, that General Assembly will take much more lead and will try to bypass Security Council, if not in binding votes and binding resolution, but at least to create an atmosphere to sideline, to a certain extent, UN Security Council, because of course most of countries, UN members, are very much sad that P5 powers, they monopolized this veto right.
Richard, what do you think about that? Do you agree with what Fleur just described?
I think that we have seen a number of efforts over the last couple of years by the General Assembly to put pressure on the Security Council. Saudi Arabia led a big push in the General Assembly in 2012 to get the UN more involved in Syria. And then last year, when Russia vetoed a resolution criticizing the Crimea referendum, the Western countries went back to the General Assembly and got a resolution criticizing what was going on in Crimea. But the problem is the General Assembly doesn't really have teeth. And I actually think that it's not the General Assembly, but it's regional organizations like the Arab League and African Union that are going to become more and more active in response to the problems with the Security Council. And we've definitely seen the Saudis and others in the Arab League say over the last couple of years that they feel the UN has failed in the Middle East, and they now want to take the lead on interventions and peacekeeping with their own regional body. Something similar is happening in the African Union, but African countries lack the resources that the Arabs have. So I think we're going to see power flowing away not just from the Security Council, but from the UN as a whole to regional organizations.
Yeah, you, I would say, predicted my question about this trend, which we can currently observe, especially in Ukraine, that the regional organizations such as OSCE, basically, is getting more and more stake and playing more role in that crisis. So, Fedor, do you agree with this, that this regionalization, if I may put it this way, of dealing with conflicts is a major, starting to become a major trend?
Unfortunately not. I won't agree with this. You mentioned OSCE in Ukraine. To me, OSCE in Ukraine failed as much as all others did. So OSCE failed to prevent it. OSCE is failing to seriously influence this conflict. Of course, it's absolutely natural that regional organizations should be major actors in regional crisis management. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen yet. When we talk about regionalization, I would rather think about another trend which would have impact not necessarily on the UN, but on many other so-called universal, worldwide ranging structures like institutions like WTO, for example. We see gradual formation of mega blocks, of big trade, investment, economic blocks. First of all, led by the United States, this TTIP and TPP, but also in Eurasia we see attempts by Russia and China to build something common, and that will change not at the beginning, at least initially, not approaches to crisis management, but it will step by step change the whole mechanisms, how international economy is working. And we know, we in Russia at least, like myself, I still studied Marxism at the university, and we learned that economy defines everything else. So I think major economic reshuffle in the world will have inevitable impact on political institutions as well.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that basically the like economics and economic integration projects would grab more power in designing the trends in global affairs. So kind of like taking more duties and responsibilities.
That's another question, whether those organizations will take more duties and responsibilities vis-à-vis others, because that's another issue. So I think the crisis management ability is not improving in today's world, rather the opposite. But those organizations will be there to serve members, to serve countries which are inside. In this regard, I'm afraid that the level of general international egoism will rise.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it seems like we have some technical problems, and we
lost Richard.
Yeah, Richard is back.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Richard is back.
I apologize for that. The
Okay,
internet died momentarily.
Perfect timing. So, can you agree with what further just described about the trend of like shifting power towards economic institutions, economic unions such as Eurasian Economic Union or TTP, which is led by the United States?
I think we're definitely seeing that in the economic sphere, but it's not clear that those economic blocs are going to turn into security arrangements and that they will challenge the UN in the security field. I think what is universally true, though, is that there is a fragmentation of the international system. And we can look at regional organizations, we can look at economic blocs, we can look at the tensions between the G7 and the BRICS. And I think those are all symptoms of an international system that is becoming less and less centralized and more fragmented. And the UN remains the one security body that rises above that, and the place where Russia, China, and the US can talk about issues such as Syria or North Korea. And I think it will continue to have value in that sense, but its power is clearly reduced by the overall sense of a system that is gradually coming apart.
So what you're saying basically that UN is above those processes of fragmentation of international system, and it shouldn't deal or do something with that, prevent or adjust to it, right?
I think that the UN has to adjust to it in some ways. For example, we mentioned the African Union. The UN has set up a pretty effective partnership with the African Union on peacekeeping operations in places like Somalia. In some cases, the UN can work with regional bodies. But ultimately, the UN, I think the UN's final value, as I say, is to be the institution of the last resort. It's where the big powers go when they have a very, very serious problem they cannot address through other means, such as the Syrian crisis. And that is its lasting value. Of course, as we've already said, the Syrian crisis shows that even if you go to the UN in the last resort, you may not get very many results.
So I think it's a very pressing question, and a lot of journalists and experts ask it. What is expected to be mentioned, and what issues are expected to be raised by world leaders during the general debate next week? So on September 28th in the morning, President Obama and President Putin will both address the UN General Assembly. So what do you see, what questions could they rise? What propositions could they make? Further, could you please start with that?
I can imagine what President Putin can say in this speech. I don't believe, as some people suggested recently, that he would come to New York to deliver another Munich speech to criticize the West for everything. I don't think so. I think the speech will be centered around Syria, around the Middle East, and more particular around Islamic State, because it seems that rightly or wrongly, but this issue is now becoming the real core for Russian foreign policy priorities. And what happens these days in Syria, the clear increase of Russian support to the government is part of Russian general approach that everybody who fights against Islamists in Syria should be supported. And I'm pretty sure that Putin will try to convince rest of General Assembly that everybody should be together to fight this evil It seems that the counter-terrorism rhetorics is not enough anymore, because Islamic State is actually not about terrorism. It's something much bigger and much more serious than terrorists which we used to imagine in Al-Qaeda and others. So I think that will be the main point of Putin. Certainly he will mention Ukraine, but just my feeling is that Russian side and even Russian officials are, how to put it in the correct way, are pretty tired of Ukrainian issue, and they will be happy to switch to something else.
Mm-hmm. Richard, what do you think about that?
I think Syria is going to dominate the discussions. There are a lot of other issues. I think there will be quite a lot of self-congratulation over the Iranian deal, and on the 28th, Obama will be there. Rouhani is also there from Tehran, and that will be a feel-good topic of conversation. There will be discussions, especially from European leaders, of the climate change summit that is coming up in Paris at the end of the year, which is meant to be the world's great opportunity to limit carbon emissions. That will be something you hear about a lot. But very frankly, the urgency of the Syrian crisis, the Islamic State, and the flow of refugees into Europe are really going to dominate the headlines. And everyone will be watching to see what Putin says. I think that although President Obama sort of leads off the big power speeches in New York, it's Putin who is going to suck up most of the airtime. If he makes any indication that he is willing to compromise on Assad's future to get a deal with the West over Syria and the Islamic State, that will be a huge breakthrough. I rather doubt he's going to say that, but that's what people will be listening for.
So, what do you think this UN gathering, is it rather an opportunity for a breakthrough in the relations between Russia and the West, in particular Russia and the US, or it is rather a risky platform where the tensions could escalate?
I agree with Fyodor. I don't think we will see a lot of nasty speeches by the West against Russia or by Putin against the West. I think that this is generally understood to be an opportunity for all sides to make positive noises, to talk about the Iran deal, to talk about possibly escalating the common fight against the Islamic State. And I think everyone wants this to be a successful summit, rather like the 2013 General Assembly delivered the deal on Syrian chemical weapons and how to dismantle those. Behind the scenes, though, there will be a lot of skepticism. I don't think that even if President Putin makes a very broad offer of compromises on Syria, that the West will be completely convinced that he's changed his views of the situation. And I'm sure there will be a lot of muttering in the background that Russia's position on this may shift again. So I don't really think there's going to be a breakthrough, but I think that in public, at least, people will try to be positive.
Well, generally speaking, could this UN General Assembly session possibly become a milestone for the organization, for the institution itself?
I don't think it will be a milestone which will, I don't know, change course or define a new course for the UN. I agree with what Richard said about possible words and speeches, but I think we should be realistic about the UN and in particular about the relationship between major powers. This is not time for any kind of breakthroughs. The general mistrust is huge. I don't say only about Russia and the West. In our case, it's really disastrous. I don't remember any. I don't remember that level of mistrust since I don't know which time. In the Cold War time, it was bad enough, but to a certain extent it was better because there were rules of mistrust, rules how to verify, and that worked. Now it isn't. But also between China and the United States. For example, Xi Jinping is now in the United States with a big tour, big visit. That's very tense, and certainly both sides distrust each other. And if we look at any regions, any issues, that's very difficult. So we should not expect any breakthroughs. What we can expect, a rational behavior in particular issues when sides understand that just here, we can find some kind of common ground which will not change the nature of our relationship, but which can help us to settle one problem. And in this regard, what Richard mentioned about 2013, this chemical weapons initiative, that was a very positive example when it did not change nature of relationship between Russia and the United States, but it helped to settle one problem.
Mm-hmm. Richard, you generally agree with that?
I think so, and I think this comes back to my point that the UN's greatest strength sometimes is to provide a platform for countries that fundamentally disagree on big issues to work out compromises on specific problems. And even in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US were able to cooperate at the UN on issues such as setting up peacekeeping forces in the Middle East to act as buffers between Israel and its neighbors. And the situation in the UN during the Cold War was much, much worse than it is now, and yet some forms of cooperation were still possible. And so when I look at the Security Council today, and when I look at the General Assembly session coming up, I don't expect a transformation of international relations. I don't think that a visit to New York is going to change President Putin's DNA or President Xi's DNA. But I think that this is an institution where, if everyone wants it enough, we can still make concrete deals despite all our differences. And that's why the UN is worth keeping alive.
So in sort of rare question about can you name 3, 5, or 2 main threats or challenges which the UN will face in the coming decade?
The UN as an institution, or you mean the UN as a representative of international community?
Both.
As for institution, I think the doubts in legitimacy of UN Security Council will grow, and dissatisfaction of many countries with the situation that winners of the war which ended 70 years ago still, so to say, decide and have privileges, that will grow, and that will generate more and more attempts to bypass the UN Security Council, which is not really possible, but at least atmosphere will be like this. As for and by the way, one way to try to influence UN by other countries is finance. So those who would like to express their mistrust or dissatisfaction, they can stop giving money, and the United States used this tool several times in the past, by the way. As for international community, I think we should really be very, very cautious when it comes to local conflicts with the global impact, global implication. We are, I'm afraid, a bit. We believe that big war is impossible, And this is to a certain extent legacy of the Cold War, the second half of the Cold War, when nuclear deterrence worked as a limit for adventurism. Now I'm afraid we lost this ability to be cautious because of fear. And to a certain extent, I understand that it sounds terrible, but I think that we need to remind and to remember this fear.
Mm-hmm. Richard, what is your estimate?
I think Fjord is absolutely right to mention money. I think that a lot of what the UN does is now very expensive. The UN asks every year for around $16 billion just for its humanitarian operations, and another $8 or $9 billion for its peacekeeping operations. And that money is in short supply. The European countries that used to be, and still are, main donors to the UN have their own problems, and they need to keep that money to deal with Greece and other internal issues. And so we are seeing money for UN humanitarian missions really drying up. And if the UN cannot look after refugees or feed the starving, then that will do immense damage to its overall global credibility. On the point about conflict and the possibility of big power conflict, I do fear that if there were to be any significant outbreak of hostilities in Asia involving China, whether over the East China Sea or the South China Sea, then the UN would be irrelevant, and that divisions between China and the US would do immense damage to the Security Council, make it much harder for the Security Council to function, and actually do greater damage than the Ukrainian or even the Syrian crises have done to the UN so far.
Thank you, gentlemen, for this insightful conversation. Appreciate your opinions and your views. I remind our audience that we had Fyodor Lukyanov with us, editor-in-chief of Russia and Global Affairs Journal, and the chairman of the Russian think tank, the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. Thank you, Fyodor, for joining us. And we also had with us Richard Bowen, the associate professor at Columbia University and a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you again. Hope we'll see if your predictions about the speeches on September 28th will become true or not. Thank you again, gentlemen.
Thank you.